The winter of 1887 had been merciless to the Arizona Territory. Dakota moved silently through the pine-scented darkness, his moccasins barely disturbing the fresh snow that blanketed the rugged terrain near the Chiricahua Mountains. At 28, he had learned to read the mountain's moods like an old friend's face, and tonight the mountain whispered of danger. The blizzard had been raging for 3 days, unusual for this region where winter storms typically passed quickly. Dakota pulled his elk-hide coat tighter around his shoulders, the fur-lined hood protecting his weathered face from the biting wind. He was returning from checking his trap lines when he saw her. At first, he thought it was a fallen log covered in snow. But as he approached, his keen eyes caught the unnatural curve of a human form. A young woman lay crumpled between 2 frost-covered boulders, her pale blue dress now stiff with ice. Her blonde hair, once probably pinned in the fashion of white settlers, now spread like golden threads across the white ground. Dakota's breath caught in his throat. She was barely breathing, her lips a dangerous shade of blue. Without hesitation, he knelt beside her, his strong hands checking for signs of life. Her pulse was weak, but steady. He had seen death from exposure before. She was close, very close. "Sister," he whispered in Apache, using the term his grandmother had taught him for all women who needed protection. "What brought you to Uson's mountain in such a storm?" She couldn't answer. Her eyes fluttered briefly, revealing startling green irises before closing again. Dakota made his decision quickly. The nearest white settlement was 20 miles away through impossible conditions. His winter camp in the high mountains was closer, and he knew these paths even in a blizzard. Carefully, he wrapped her in his warmest blanket, a beautiful piece his sister Ayana had woven with traditional Apache patterns. The woman was slight, probably no more than 100 pounds, but the dead weight of unconsciousness made her difficult to maneuver. Dakota lifted her gently, cradling her against his chest. "I've got you," he murmured, beginning the treacherous climb toward his hidden camp. "Uson has brought you to me for a reason." The wind howled through the canyon walls as Dakota navigated the narrow trail he knew by heart. Each step was deliberate, calculated. One wrong move could send them both tumbling into the ravine below. The woman's head lolled against his shoulder, and he could feel her shallow breathing against his neck. Snow continued to fall in thick, heavy flakes that obscured everything beyond arm's reach. Dakota's powerful legs pushed through drifts that sometimes reached his knees. His lungs burned in the thin mountain air, but he pressed on, driven by something deeper than duty, a pull he couldn't quite understand. After what felt like hours, the familiar outline of his winter shelter emerged from the white darkness. Built into a natural cave and reinforced with carefully placed stones and pine boughs, it was invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Dakota had been using this camp for 3 winters, ever since the troubles with the cavalry had forced him deeper into the mountains. Inside, the cave was surprisingly warm. A small fire crackled in a carefully constructed stone circle, its smoke drawn up through a natural chimney in the rock. Buffalo hides covered the floor, and his few possessions were arranged with military precision along the walls. Dakota gently placed the woman on his own sleeping furs, immediately setting to work. Her wet clothes would kill her if he didn't act quickly. With clinical efficiency born of necessity, he removed her frozen dress and undergarments, replacing them with one of his own warm shirts and wrapping her in dry blankets. Her skin was marble white, mottled with patches of blue and purple. Dakota had seen frostbite before. He examined her fingers and toes carefully. They were cold but not yet blackened. There was hope. He built up the fire and began the slow process of warming her core temperature. Too fast would be dangerous, potentially sending her into shock. He heated stones in the fire, wrapped them in cloth, and placed them carefully around her body. Then he prepared a warm broth from dried meat and medicinal herbs his grandmother had taught him to recognize. As the hours passed, Dakota maintained his vigil. He changed the heated stones, monitored her breathing, and occasionally dripped small amounts of warm broth between her lips. She remained unconscious, but her color was slowly improving. Near dawn, as the storm finally began to subside, she stirred. Her eyes opened, those startling green eyes, and focused on his face with confusion and fear. "Easy," Takoda said softly in English, his voice carrying only the slightest accent. "You're safe. You were caught in the storm." She tried to speak, but could only manage a hoarse whisper. Where am I?" "In the mountains. You were dying when I found you." He offered her a small cup of warm broth. "Drink this, slowly." Her hands shook as she accepted the cup, and Takoda noticed the way she instinctively pulled the blankets closer around herself, a gesture that spoke of vulnerability and caution. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice like rustling leaves. "Sarah Mitchell." Takoda nodded slowly. "I am Takoda. You are alive because Usen willed it so." Sarah's eyes searched his face, taking in his long black hair, the traditional beadwork on his shirt, the undeniable gentleness in his dark eyes. She had heard stories, terrible stories, about Apache warriors, but this man had saved her life. "The storm," she said, memories beginning to surface. "My wagon. There was an accident." "Rest now," Takoda said, his voice carrying an authority that came from years of making life and death decisions. "The mountain will tell us her stories when you are stronger." As Sarah's eyes closed again, this time in natural sleep rather than unconsciousness, Takoda settled back to keep watch. Outside, the last of the storm winds whistled through the peaks, but inside their shelter, two unlikely survivors had found something neither expected: the beginning of trust. 3 days passed before Sarah was strong enough to sit up without assistance. During that time, Takoda had maintained a respectful distance, tending to her needs with the professional care of someone who understood both medicine and propriety. He had fashioned a privacy screen from pine boughs, giving her space to dress and tend to personal needs, while never straying far enough that she couldn't call for help. Sarah watched him with growing fascination. Everything about Takoda contradicted the stories she had heard in Tucson about Apache savages. His movements were graceful and purposeful, whether he was preparing food, tending the fire, or crafting new moccasins to replace her ruined boots. His English was clear and thoughtful, though she suspected he chose his words carefully. "You speak English very well," she said one morning, as he handed her a cup of pine needle tea. Takoda settled across the fire from her, maintaining the careful distance that had characterized their interactions. "I spent 2 winters at the mission school in San Carlos when I was young. Before—" He paused, his dark eyes growing distant. "Before I understood what they wanted to take from us." Sarah heard the weight behind his words. She had heard about the reservation, about the government's attempts to civilize the Apache. But seeing the intelligence and dignity in Takoda's manner, she began to question everything she thought she knew. "What happened to your wagon?" Takoda asked, deflecting attention from his own painful memories. Sarah's hands tightened around the warm cup. "I was traveling to Flagstaff to meet my fiancé, Thomas Whitman. He's establishing a cattle ranch there." Her voice grew smaller. "The wagon hit ice on a mountain pass. The driver lost control. We went over the side." "The driver." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Henderson. He didn't survive the crash. I tried to help him, but—" She shook her head, unable to continue. Takoda studied her face, reading the genuine grief there. "You stayed with him, in the storm." "I couldn't just leave him." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "By the time I realized he was gone, the storm was too strong. I got lost trying to find shelter." "That's how you ended up so far from the main trail." Takoda nodded slowly. "Your loyalty nearly cost you your life." "Maybe it should have," Sarah whispered. The words hung in the air between them. Takoda set down his own cup and leaned forward slightly. "Why do you say this?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. Thomas, he's not a kind man. The marriage was arranged by my father to settle a debt. I was traveling to a life I dreaded. Dakota felt something shift in his chest, a protective instinct he hadn't experienced since his sister's death. In my people's tradition, marriage is a choice made by both hearts. A union without love is like a bird with one wing. It cannot fly. Sarah looked up at him, surprised by the poetry in his words. Your people, do women choose their own husbands? A woman's strength is valued among the Apache. My grandmother was a war leader. My sister chose her own path until... He stopped abruptly. Until what? Dakota was quiet for so long Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried old pain. Until the cavalry came to our village 3 winters ago. She was killed trying to protect the children. Sarah's intake of breath was sharp. I'm so sorry. Ayana was brave, like you, staying with the wagon driver. Dakota's eyes met hers across the fire. Courage shows itself in many ways. Over the following days, their conversations grew longer and more personal. Sarah learned that Dakota had been living alone in the mountains since his band was forced onto the reservation. He told her about Apache traditions, about reading the signs in nature, about the spiritual beliefs that guided his people. She shared stories of her childhood in Philadelphia, her love of books, and her dreams of becoming a teacher. You read? Dakota asked one evening, genuine interest in his voice. Yes. I brought some books in my travel bag, but they were lost in the accident. Sarah's face brightened. I was hoping to start a school in Flagstaff for all children, not just... She stopped, realizing what she had almost said. Not just white children, Dakota finished, without judgment in his tone. Yes, Sarah said quietly. I know it's not conventional. The Apache believe that knowledge belongs to everyone who seeks it. Your dream honors that truth. As Sarah's strength returned, she began to help with daily tasks. Dakota taught her to identify edible plants, to read weather signs, and to move quietly through the forest. She proved to be a quick learner, her city-bred hands adapting to mountain life with surprising skill. One afternoon, while gathering firewood together, Sarah noticed Dakota favoring his left shoulder. You're hurt, she said, reaching toward him instinctively. Dakota stepped back automatically, but not before Sarah saw him wince. It's nothing, an old injury. Let me look at it, please. When he hesitated, she added, You've been taking care of me for days. Let me help you for once. Reluctantly, Dakota removed his shirt, revealing a muscular torso marked with several old scars and one area of obvious inflammation near his shoulder blade. Sarah examined it with gentle hands. This is infected, she said with concern. How long have you been dealing with this? Since before the last storm. I fell on some rocks checking the trap lines. Sarah's mind raced through her limited medical knowledge. I need to clean this properly. Do you have any alcohol or strong spirits? I have some whiskey. Traded for it last autumn. Working together, they cleaned and treated the wound. As Sarah bandaged his shoulder with strips torn from one of her petticoats, she became acutely aware of their closeness, of the warmth of his skin under her hands, of the trust he was showing by allowing her to help him. Thank you, Dakota said quietly when she finished. Their eyes met and held for a moment longer than necessary. Both felt the shift, the barrier between stranger and something more beginning to dissolve. We take care of each other, Sarah replied, echoing words he had spoken to her days earlier. That night, as they sat by the fire, the easy conversation flowed between them like a familiar song. Outside, the winter wind howled through the peaks, but inside their shelter, 2 people who had been strangers a week ago were discovering they shared more than either had expected. 2 weeks into Sarah's recovery, the mountain had revealed more of its moods. Some days brought brilliant sunshine that made the snow-covered peaks sparkle like diamonds. Other days delivered brief but fierce storms that reminded them both how precarious their situation remained. Through it all, Sarah and Dakota fell into a rhythm of survival that gradually became something deeper. Sarah had proven herself to be remarkably adaptable. She could now start a fire efficiently, prepare simple meals from their limited supplies, and move through the forest with a quietness that impressed even Dakota. More importantly, she had begun to understand the Apache way of seeing the world, the interconnectedness of all living things, the importance of taking only what was needed, the reverence for the mountain spirits. The Apache don't see themselves as separate from nature, Dakota explained one morning as they tracked deer prints in fresh snow. We are part of it. The mountain, the animals, the plants. We're all related. Sarah nodded, watching how he read signs in the snow that were invisible to her untrained eyes. In Philadelphia, I felt so disconnected, like I was living behind glass, watching life happen but not really participating in it. And now, Sarah paused, considering his question. Now I feel awake, like I've been sleeping my whole life. That afternoon, while Dakota was checking his trap lines, Sarah made a discovery that would change everything. Exploring a section of the cave they hadn't used, she found a small alcove containing items that clearly belonged to a woman. A beautifully beaded dress, silver jewelry, and a small leather journal. When Dakota returned, Sarah was sitting by the fire, the journal open in her lap. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I was just exploring and I found these things. I didn't mean to pry." Dakota's face went very still when he saw what she held. "Those belong to Ayana, my sister." The writing, "Is it Apache?" "Some of it, some English." Dakota sat down heavily across from her. She was learning to write both languages. She believed, his voice caught, she believed that understanding both worlds might help our people survive what was coming. Sarah closed the journal carefully and held it out to him, but Dakota shook his head. "She would have liked you," he said quietly. "She had the same spirit, curious, brave, kind to those who needed help. Will you tell me about her?" For the next hour, Dakota shared memories of his sister. Ayana had been 3 years younger, quick to laugh and fearless in the face of danger. She had spoken 4 languages and could outride most of the men in their band. She had also been a bridge builder, always looking for ways to create understanding between the Apache and the encroaching white world. "She was negotiating with the cavalry commander when she was killed," Dakota said, his voice raw with old grief. "She went under a flag of truce to discuss safe passage for the women and children. They shot her down in cold blood." Sarah felt tears on her cheeks. "Dakota, I'm so sorry. I can't imagine. After that, I couldn't stay on the reservation. I couldn't pretend that peace was possible." He looked directly at her. "Until now, I believed that your people and mine could never truly understand each other. And now? Now I think maybe Ayana was right. Maybe understanding is possible. One person at a time." The intensity in his voice made Sarah's heart race. She had been fighting her growing feelings for days, telling herself that gratitude was being confused with something deeper. But looking at Dakota now, seeing the pain and hope warring in his dark eyes, she could no longer deny the truth. "Dakota," she began, but he held up a hand. "There's something you need to know," he said urgently. "Yesterday, when I was hunting, I saw smoke from the direction of the main trail. Someone is looking for you." Sarah's stomach dropped. "Thomas, probably, and likely with cavalry escort." Dakota's jaw tightened. "They'll search until they find you. How long do we have?" "A few days, maybe less. The storm covered our tracks, but they'll widen their search pattern eventually." Sarah stood abruptly and began pacing the small cave. "I can't go back to him, Dakota. I can't live that life." "What are your choices?" "I don't know." The words burst out of her with surprising force. "I have no money, no family who would help me. Thomas has a legal claim as my betrothed. If I run, where would I go?" Dakota watched her pace, his mind working through possibilities. "There are people who would help you, missionaries in Santa Fe who ask no questions. Families heading west who need teachers for their children. You've thought about this? I've thought about little else since I saw that smoke. Sarah stopped pacing and looked at him directly. What about you? What will you do when they find this place? Go deeper into the mountains. Find another hiding place. Alone. Yes. The word hung between them like a physical barrier. Sarah felt something breaking inside her chest, not just her heart, but her very conception of what her life could be. Take me with you, she said suddenly. Dakota's eyes widened. Sarah, you don't understand what you're asking. Life in the mountains is hard, dangerous, and if we were caught together, they would kill you. Yes. Then we make sure they don't catch us. Dakota stood and moved to her, close enough that she could see the conflict in his eyes. You would give up everything? Your chance for a safe life in the white world? What safety? Sarah's voice was fierce with conviction. A marriage to a man who sees me as property? A life where I can never speak my mind or follow my dreams? That's not safety, Dakota. That's a different kind of death. And you think life with me would be better? Sarah reached up and touched his face gently, feeling the warmth of his skin under her palm. I think life with you would be real. Whatever else it might be, hard, dangerous, uncertain, it would be honest. Dakota closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. Sarah, if we do this, there's no going back. Your world will never accept you again. Then we'll make our own world. When Dakota opened his eyes, Sarah saw her answer there. Without words, he pulled her into his arms, and for the first time since he had found her in the snow, there was no careful distance between them. We'll need to leave tomorrow night, he said against her hair. Travel by darkness until we're far from the search area. I'll be ready. It won't be easy. Sarah pulled back to look at him, her green eyes blazing with determination. Nothing worth having ever is. That night, they made their plans. Sarah would leave behind everything that marked her as a woman of white society. Dakota would take only what they could carry on foot. They would head deeper into the Chiricahua Mountains, to places where even the Apache rarely traveled. As they prepared for sleep, Sarah lay in her furs, listening to the wind outside and thinking about the choice she had made. In Philadelphia, her life had been planned for her from birth. Here, with Dakota, she was choosing her own path for the first time. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was freedom. Dawn broke crisp and clear on what would be Sarah and Dakota's last day at the winter camp. They had packed through the night, taking only the most essential items for survival in the deep wilderness. Sarah wore clothes Dakota had modified from his own, warm, practical garments that would allow her to move quickly and quietly through the mountains. Once we leave, we can't stop for anything, Dakota said, as he secured their supplies. The first day will be the hardest. We need to put as much distance as possible between us and anyone following. Sarah nodded, testing the weight of her pack. It was heavier than anything she had ever carried, but she had been preparing for this moment all week. I'm ready. They were just finishing their preparations when Dakota suddenly went very still, his head tilted in a listening posture that Sarah had learned to recognize. What is it? Horses, he whispered. Coming up the main trail, moving fast. Sarah's blood ran cold. How many? At least 6, maybe more. Dakota moved swiftly to the cave entrance, peering carefully through the concealing brush. They're still a mile out, but they're heading this way. They found our trail? No, this is a systematic search. Dakota's voice was grim. They're checking every possible shelter location in the area. Sarah felt panic rising in her throat. What do we do? Dakota was already moving, gathering the last of their supplies with efficient urgency. We leave, now. There's a back way out of the cave that leads to the North Ridge. It's steep and dangerous, but it's our only chance. In daylight, won't they see us? Not if we're careful, and not if we're lucky. They extinguished the fire and scattered the ashes, erasing as much evidence of their presence as possible. Dakota led Sarah through a narrow passage at the back of the cave that she hadn't even noticed before. It opened onto a ledge barely wide enough for one person, with a sheer drop of several hundred feet to the rocks below. "Stay close," Dakota whispered. "Step exactly where I step. Don't look down." The climb was the most terrifying thing Sarah had ever experienced. The wind seemed stronger here, tugging at her clothes and pack. Ice made the handholds treacherous. More than once, loose rocks skittered away under her feet, clattering down the cliff face with sounds that seemed impossibly loud. They had been climbing for nearly an hour when they heard voices below. "Check that cave! Looks like someone's been here recently. Fresh ash in the fire pit." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She pressed herself against the rock wall, trying to become invisible. Dakota had stopped just above her, his body tense with listening. "Find anything? Blankets? Food supplies? Someone's been living here." "The girl? Maybe. Or maybe just some drifter. Hard to tell. Keep looking. She's got to be somewhere." But the voices continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Sarah could hear the men moving around below, searching through their abandoned camp. Finally, the sounds began to fade as the search party moved on to the next location. Dakota waited until complete silence had returned before motioning for Sarah to continue climbing. They didn't speak until they reached the top of the ridge, nearly 2 hours later. "That was too close," Sarah gasped, collapsing onto a flat boulder to catch her breath. "It's not over yet. They'll be back when they don't find you anywhere else." Dakota scanned the horizon, his experienced eyes reading the terrain. "We need to reach the deep canyon before nightfall. It's the only place we can travel safely after dark." They set off immediately, moving with the urgent efficiency of hunted animals. Dakota led them along game trails that were invisible to Sarah's untrained eyes, paths that wound through dense forest and across rocky ridges where their footprints would be harder to follow. The physical demands of the journey were beyond anything Sarah had ever experienced. Her pack felt like it gained weight with every mile. Her legs burned with fatigue, and her lungs struggled with the thin mountain air. But every time she thought about stopping, she remembered Thomas Whitman's cold eyes and the life of suffocation that awaited her if she were caught. They were descending into a deep ravine when disaster struck. Sarah's foot hit a patch of hidden ice, and she slipped, sliding toward the edge of a steep drop-off. Dakota lunged forward, catching her wrist just as she went over, but the momentum pulled them both down onto a narrow ledge, 15 feet below the trail. "Sarah, are you hurt?" She took careful inventory. "My ankle. I think I twisted it." Dakota examined the injury with gentle hands. "It's not broken, but it's badly sprained. Can you put weight on it?" Sarah tried to stand and immediately gasped in pain. "Not much." Dakota looked up at the trail they had fallen from, then at the terrain around them. They were trapped on the ledge with no easy way up or down, and Sarah could barely walk. "We can't stay here," he said grimly. "When they realize you weren't at any of the shelters, they'll start tracking us properly. A man named Bill Morrison scouts for the cavalry. He's good enough to follow our trail even over rock." "Leave me," Sarah said quietly. Dakota's head snapped around to stare at her. "What?" "You heard me. I'm slowing you down, and now I'm injured. If you leave me here, they'll find me and take me back to Thomas. You can disappear into the mountains." "No. Dakota, be practical. This way we both live." "That's not living!" Dakota's voice was fierce. "Not for either of us." "Then what do you suggest?" Dakota studied the ravine walls, his mind working through possibilities. "There's another way. Dangerous, but possible. At the bottom of this canyon is an old Apache trail that leads to the sacred caves. My people used it for vision quests. It's been abandoned for years because it's so difficult to navigate." "How difficult?" "Parts of it require climbing with ropes. Other sections go through underground passages that flood during storms." Dakota met her eyes. "People have died trying to use that trail." "And if we make it?" "The caves connect to a hidden valley on the other side of the mountain range. There's water, game, shelter. We could build a life there." Sarah looked down at the canyon floor, hundreds of feet below. With my ankle, I'll help you. Every step of the way. Why? Why risk your life for someone you've known for 3 weeks? Dakota was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute truth. Because in 3 weeks, you've shown me more trust, more understanding, more connection than I've felt since Ayanna died. Because when I look at you, I see the future my sister dreamed of, where people could choose love over fear. Tears ran down Sarah's cheeks. And because I love you. Yes, and because I love you. The words hung in the mountain air between them, precious and dangerous and absolutely true. Then we go down, Sarah said firmly. Together. The descent took the rest of the day. Dakota fashioned a crude splint for Sarah's ankle and helped her navigate each treacherous step. They used ropes made from braided leather to lower themselves down the steepest sections. Sarah's hands were raw and bleeding by the time they reached the canyon floor, but she never complained. As the sun set behind the peaks, they found the entrance to the ancient trail, a narrow gap between 2 massive boulders that was almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. From here on, it gets harder, Dakota warned. Sarah looked back up at the towering walls of the canyon, thinking about the men who were surely still hunting for them, somewhere above. Then she looked at Dakota, this man who had risked everything to save her, who had shown her what it meant to choose your own path. I'm not afraid, she said, and remarkably she realized it was true. As they disappeared into the darkness of the ancient trail, 2 sets of footprints in the snow marked the last evidence of their passage. By morning, even those would be covered by fresh powder, as if Sarah Mitchell and Dakota had never existed in the world they left behind. But in the hidden valley beyond the sacred caves, they would build something new, a life chosen freely, built on mutual respect and love, proof that understanding between worlds was not only possible, but transformative. The mountain had tested them, but they had emerged not broken, but stronger. Their story would become legend, among the few Apache who still remembered the old ways, the tale of 2 people who dared to love across the boundaries of worlds, who chose freedom over safety, and who proved that the human heart recognizes no borders when it finds its true home. Epilogue. Years later, traders would sometimes report glimpsing a man and woman in the deepest mountains, living in harmony with the land. They spoke of a woman with sun-streaked hair who could track like an Apache, and a man who could read and write in multiple languages. Some said they had children who grew up speaking both English and Apache, learning the stories of 2 peoples. Others claimed they founded a hidden settlement where outcasts from both worlds could find acceptance. But those who knew the mountains best would only smile when asked about these stories. They understood that some truths are too precious to speak aloud, and that love, like the mountain spirits themselves, moves in mysterious ways that cannot be fully captured in words. The important thing was not whether the stories were fact or legend, but what they represented, the possibility that understanding, respect, and love could bridge any divide, no matter how vast it seemed. And high in the Chiricahua Mountains, where the wind carries the scent of pine and the promise of snow, some say you can still hear the echo of their laughter, a sound that speaks of freedom found and choices made with courage.